Frank Miller always said the neighborhood woke up the same way every morning, with the sound of sprinklers arguing in the distance and the smell of someone else's coffee drifting across the street. His own coffee maker hissed and sputtered like it was negotiating peace terms, but it always delivered in the end. He'd sit on his porch, mug in hand, faded Air Force cap tilted just enough to block the sun, and watch the world stretch its legs. Kids wobbling on bikes, neighbors dragging trash cans, a dog or two making their rounds like elected officials. Frank loved that quiet. After 25 years fixing planes in places that never slept, he had learned to appreciate silence almost as much as he appreciated working carburetors. His property sat on half an acre, just enough space to feel like home, not so much he needed a tractor to manage it. And most importantly, it sat outside the jurisdiction of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. He checked that 3 times when he bought it. He enjoyed order, but the kind he controlled, not the kind that arrived in laminated packets. His morning routine didn't change much. Coffee, porch, dog named Hopper snoring at his feet, and a slow walk to check the mailbox even though real mail came maybe twice a week. He liked the feel of the gravel path under his boots, the crunch that reminded him he was on his own land, not anyone else's. On most days, that mailbox held nothing but circulars and coupons he'd never use. But on this particular morning, the first hint that life was about to get interesting rolled up on 4 bald tires and a suspicion of self-importance. Frank noticed the silver sedan before Hopper did, which said something, because that dog barked at clouds, shadows, and occasionally his own reflection. The car moved slowly, creeping along the cul-de-sac like it was studying the wildlife, or hunting it. Frank didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of drivers used the circle as a turnaround. But this one didn't turn. It stopped directly across from his driveway. A man got out, mid-40s, polo shirt tucked so tightly into his khakis it looked painful. He held a clipboard and a phone, which he immediately lifted and pointed toward Frank's truck. Click, click, click. Frank raised a hand in a lazy wave. Morning. The man didn't wave back. He squinted at Frank's truck, snapped more photos, then walked a purposeful circle around it like an art critic deciding whether the sculpture offended him. Frank took another sip of coffee. Hopper, he said gently. We've got a live one. Hopper lifted his head, snorted, then resumed snoring. The man finally noticed Frank watching and offered a tight smile, the kind that wasn't a smile at all. Just documenting a community concern, he said. Ha! Frank replied, because that seemed like the safest answer when you weren't sure whether someone was being official or just strange. The man didn't elaborate. He got back in his car and drove off without so much as a goodbye. Frank frowned, replaying the moment in his head. Community concern? About what? His truck wasn't flashy, wasn't leaking anything, wasn't even loud. If anything, the truck had been a community blessing. He'd once hauled a neighbor's broken hot tub away in it for free, which earned him a cherry pie and the respect of the neighborhood dogs. Still, he shrugged it off. People did weird things before lunch. Hours later, after fixing a rattling AC panel and rehanging a neighbor's door, Frank returned home and noticed something taped to his mailbox. Bright yellow, flapping angrily in the breeze like it had something to say. He pulled it off and unfolded it. Oak Ridge HOA violation notice. Non-compliant vehicle parked in neighborhood view. Immediate action required. Frank blinked at it, then blinked again slower. He looked at his driveway. He looked at the letter. He looked back at his driveway as though a secret HOA meeting might suddenly materialize there. He walked up the path, letter in hand, reading the rest of it out loud to Hopper as he went. Your vehicle does not meet visual conformity requirements stated in bylaw for B. Must be relocated within 24 hours, subject to fines. He stopped walking. Fines? For what? Hopper wagged his tail, which Frank interpreted as moral support. Inside, Frank set the letter on the kitchen counter, poured himself 1 inch of fresh coffee, then leaned over it again. The more he read, the stranger it seemed. Every line referenced rules, regulations, and mandatory compliance. He checked his address printed at the top. It wasn't even correct, close, but not quite right. He walked out to the property marker at the edge of his yard, an old metal stake with the county tag. He tapped it with his boot for good measure. Yep, still exactly where it was supposed to be, and definitely outside the HOA's domain. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Some poor office worker must have mixed up house numbers. He'd seen worse. A neighbor once received a water bill addressed to occupant or resident of the blue house with the loud wind chimes. Bureaucracy was a creative animal. He decided to call the number listed at the bottom of the notice. It rang 3 times before a chirpy voice answered. Oak Ridge HOA. This is Marla. Hi there, Marla. I think there's been a mix-up. I got a notice about my truck, but I'm not actually part of the HOA. There was a pause, then the sound of keyboard clicking. What's your address? He gave it. She typed, paused, typed again. According to our records, you are within visual jurisdiction. Visual jurisdiction? Frank repeated, raising an eyebrow even though she couldn't see it. Yes, she said cheerfully, as though announcing a prize. If your property is visible from within the HOA, we have the right to regulate anything that impacts aesthetic harmony. Frank looked at his own house, which sat a full 50 feet back from the road behind a row of trees. Harmony seemed to be doing just fine without them. Well, he said slowly, I'm not in your HOA. The county boundary line is right at the oak tree. Residents claim that all the time, she said in the tone of someone who had heard many lies and classified them all equally. You'll still need to move the vehicle. Frank stared at the phone as if it might start smoking. Ma'am, I don't think that's how this works. We'll send a follow-up notice, she said. Please don't, he replied. Already did, she said, and hung up. Frank stood there for a long moment before letting out a single dry laugh. Hopper trotted over, tail wagging, as if asking whether they were going for a ride. Frank rubbed his head. Buddy, I think the neighborhood's about to get interesting. As the sun dipped lower and the sprinklers kicked on again with their familiar tsk, Frank walked back to the porch with the yellow notice in hand. He stared at it for a long time, the corners fluttering in the evening breeze, and shook his head. That letter, he muttered, changed everything. Frank figured the second notice would take a few days to arrive. Bureaucracy usually moved at the speed of spilled molasses. But the Oak Ridge HOA, as he was quickly learning, was a different animal altogether, an animal with clipboards for claws and highlighters for fangs. The next morning, before Frank even had a chance to sit down with his mug of coffee, something slapped against his front door hard enough to make Hopper bark from the bedroom. Frank opened the door to find a neon orange envelope stuck under a magnet advertising Todd's Lawn Consulting, Precision, Perfection, Pride. Inside the envelope was the follow-up notice. Only this time, the HOA had upgraded their tone to stern disappointment, the kind you'd expect from a middle school principal who caught you chewing gum in class. Second warning. Vehicle in violation of Bylaw 4B remains in non-conformance. Fines may be applied retroactively. Retroactively, like he'd committed some kind of historical crime. Frank snorted and set the letter on the counter with the first one. 2 notices in 24 hours. That had to be a record. If they kept this up, he'd have a whole scrapbook by the end of the month. He grabbed his coffee, stepped outside, and barely made it 2 sips before he noticed something off in the cul-de-sac. A navy blue sedan idling. A man leaning out the window. Camera raised. Click, click, click. Oh, for crying out loud, Frank muttered. Todd, the guy who'd taken photos the previous day, was back. This time he was leaning halfway out the driver's side window like a wildlife photographer trying to capture a rare, endangered species. The common American pickup truck in its natural habitat. Frank raised a hand in greeting. Morning. Todd didn't respond, just snapped another photo. Frank called out, Want one with me standing next to it? I can smile real big. Todd rolled up his window slowly, deliberately, and drove off without a word. Hopper, trotting beside him, gave a low woof, which Frank interpreted as, that man's weird, Dad. The weirdness escalated faster than Frank expected. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside again to find yet another envelope. This one shoved between his windshield wipers like a passive-aggressive parking ticket. It was the same orange envelope, the same logo from Todd's Lawn Consulting, the same dramatic wording. Third notice. Failure to comply will result in scheduled HOA review. Frank stared at the truck, then at the envelope, then at the sky. Review what? My bumper. Hopper wagged his tail sympathetically and dropped a tennis ball at Frank's feet, as if suggesting a healthier activity than arguing with reality. Frank marched inside and called the HOA office again. Marla answered with her usual sing-song voice. Oak Ridge HOA. This is Marla. How can I help you achieve compliance today? Frank closed his eyes for a patient moment. Marla, I've received 3 notices in 2 days. That's wonderful, she said brightly. It means the system is working. Working, Frank repeated. Yes. It's designed to escalate until the issue is resolved. Frank took a steady breath. Ma'am, I am not part of your HOA. In your opinion, she said sweetly. In the county's opinion, he corrected. She hesitated, just long enough for him to picture her frowning at her computer screen like it had betrayed her. If your truck is visible from the subdivision, she said, it affects the community's aesthetic. Ma'am, Frank replied. Your president has 3 flamingos in her front yard and a windmill that squeaks whenever the humidity rises above 50%. Silence. Then a sharp click. She hung up. Frank stared at the phone. Hopper, they hung up on me. I'm officially dealing with a cult. Hopper sneezed in agreement. It didn't take long for the situation to get even stranger. By evening, Frank's neighbor Jim showed up uninvited, holding a plastic cup of iced tea and wearing the grin of a man who loved drama that wasn't his. You hear they posted your truck? Jim asked. Posted it where? Facebook group, Jim said. Oak Ridge Community Chat. They blurred your license plate, but... Well, not very well. Frank winced. Let me guess, keyboard warriors? You got it, Jim said, sipping his tea like it was popcorn. Half the comments say your truck is lowering property values. Other half say you're a freedom-loving legend sticking it to big HOA. Frank rubbed the bridge of his nose. I just parked in my driveway. And thus, Jim said with mock solemnity, a hero was born. Later that night, Frank checked the HOA's public Facebook page. Sure enough, they'd posted a photo labeled, Neighborhood Reminder About Vehicle Requirements. His truck was circled in red, and the blur over his plate looked like a child had scribbled with a digital crayon. He kept scrolling and found comments like, looks like a yard sale truck. Rules are rules. Whoever owns that truck clearly hates order. My cousin had a truck like that once. Broke down every other Thursday. Frank chuckled dryly. The truck ran better than half the cars in the HOA. He'd rebuilt the engine himself. Still, the public shaming annoyed him more than he expected. It wasn't the truck. It was the principle. He hadn't broken any rules because he wasn't under any rules. He was thinking about all this the next morning when a knock sounded at the door. Not a polite knock. A trot up the stairs and hit it with authority knock. Frank opened the door to find Linda, the HOA president herself. Perfect hair, perfect posture, clipboard hugged to her chest like a life raft. Mr. Miller, she said sharply. We need to talk. Frank silently counted to 5. Morning, Linda. She didn't return the greeting. Your truck remains in violation of community standards. It's my driveway, Frank reminded her. Our community must maintain visual consistency, she replied. Your flamingos break your own rules, he said without missing a beat. Her face twitched. Only slightly, but enough to confirm he'd struck a nerve. That's different, she said. How? They're tasteful. Frank stifled a laugh. Linda, I'm not in your HOA. Yes, you are, she insisted. No, I'm really not. Her jaw tightened. The board disagrees. Frank wanted to ask how many times the board had disagreed with reality, but he kept that thought to himself. He simply said, I'm not moving my truck. Linda leaned in a little, lowering her voice in a way she probably thought sounded intimidating. We can escalate this. Frank raised an eyebrow. To who? The lawn police. She didn't appreciate the humor. Expect further action, she declared. Spinning on her heel and stomping away like a general retreating from a battlefield, she refused to admit she'd lost. Frank watched her go, feeling a mix of irritation and amusement. He'd dealt with fighter jets that were easier to reason with. That night, Hopper barked at something outside. Frank went to the window. Todd. Again. This time crawling out of his car's sunroof to get a better angle. Frank opened the door. Todd. You need help. Todd squeaked, nearly dropping his phone, then scrambled back inside the car and drove off like he was fleeing a crime scene. Frank closed the door and sighed. Buddy, he murmured to Hopper. I thought that was the end of it. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. Frank always thought he had the patience of a saint. 25 years working on fighter jets will do that to a man. You learn to breathe, slow your pulse, and stay calm under pressure. Whether it's a flashing warning light or a pilot yelling into your headset about a vibration that doesn't exist. But even saints crack. Even stoics reach a line they won't cross. And for Frank, that moment arrived on a Thursday morning when Hopper barked at yet another envelope taped aggressively to his front door. He didn't open it immediately, not because he didn't care, but because he already knew exactly what it was. The fourth variation of the same ridiculous letter. Violation. Non-compliance. Mandatory correction. The words were starting to feel like a parody of themselves. Frank set the envelope aside, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and walked out to the porch to enjoy it. The morning air was crisp. The neighborhood was quiet. And for a brief moment, Frank felt normal again, until a shadow crossed his driveway. He glanced over. Todd was back. Not just Todd with his camera phone. Todd with a tripod. Frank blinked. Morning, Todd. Todd didn't respond. He knelt on the pavement and began setting up the tripod with surgical precision, as though preparing for a National Geographic special. He adjusted the angle, stepped back, tilted it 2 degrees, then repositioned it by an inch. Frank watched this ritual like watching someone slowly unravel a roll of duct tape. Eventually Todd lifted his camera, pointed it directly at Frank's truck, and snapped a burst of photos rapid fire. Click, 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 click. Then another. And another. Frank counted at least 30 shots before Todd stepped back to admire them. Getting your good side? Frank called. Todd jumped, startled, then muttered something unintelligible and hurried back to his car. The tripod collapsed awkwardly as he tried to fold it too quickly, and he tripped over it before tossing everything in the back seat and driving off like a man fleeing an emotional crime scene. Frank shook his head. Enough was enough. He went back inside, opened the newest envelope, and read it carefully. Same script, same accusation, same demand. The part that pushed him over the edge wasn't even the fine. They could threaten fines all they wanted. It was the final line at the bottom. Failure to comply will result in HOA board evaluation and potential escalation. Escalation? Over a truck? Over him existing outside of an HOA he wasn't part of? Frank set the paper down slowly. Buddy, he said to Hopper. I think they crossed the line. Hopper looked at him, tail wagging, as if saying, good. I've been waiting. Frank wasn't a man easily provoked. But if the HOA wanted escalation, he'd give them escalation. Just not the kind they expected. He grabbed his keys, patted Hopper's head, and headed for the truck. Oh, the irony. And drove straight to the county courthouse. The records building was older, built of sturdy bricks and long fluorescent hallways that hummed like they were thinking too hard. Frank walked up to the counter where a clerk with glasses too big for her face was typing furiously at a computer. Morning, Frank said politely. I'm trying to confirm boundary lines and parcel ownership for an address. She pushed her glasses up. Parcel number? Frank handed her the printouts he'd gathered earlier. These right here. I think my property boundaries are being misinterpreted. The clerk typed for a moment, her eyebrows raising. Well, that's interesting. Good interesting? Frank asked. Depends who you are, she replied. She printed something out and handed it to him. This parcel here, 18B. What do you know about it? Frank studied the shape on the map. He recognized it immediately. The pond, the walking path, even the little storage shed with the peeling paint. All of it was on that parcel. That came up for tax auction, the clerk explained. Went for a shockingly low price, probably because nobody realized what was sitting on it. Frank blinked. You mean? Yup, she said. Whoever bought it owns all of that. Frank felt a slow, creeping realization spread through him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his own paperwork from the auction months ago. A deed he'd bought on a whim, thinking it was a bit of scrubland he could clean up later. Parcel 18B. His name. Frank stared at the documents, then laughed, out loud, in the middle of the county office. The clerk jumped. Something funny? Frank tried to contain himself. Ma'am, you have no idea. He left the office with a stack of documents under his arm and a new plan forming in his mind. A quiet rebellion. Polite counterpunch. Something that would finally bring the madness to a halt. Back home, he spread the papers across his kitchen table. Hopper sat in a chair beside him like a furry assistant. They both studied the maps. Well, boy, Frank said. Looks like we own a pond. Hopper wagged his tail enthusiastically, which Frank took as approval. He drafted a letter carefully, taking his time with the language. He wasn't interested in revenge, just fairness, justice, the restoration of sanity. But he also wasn't going to let the HOA bully him with rules they didn't even understand. The letter was polite, professional, sharp enough to cut steel. In it, he noted, he was not part of the HOA, had never been part of the HOA, and could not legally be forced into the HOA. The HOA had been occupying his land without a lease or permission. He was offering them a simple choice: sign a modest lease agreement to continue using the land, or cease all use of the pond, walking areas, and shed within 30 days. His favorite line was toward the end. Given your repeated concerns regarding property boundaries, I trust you will appreciate the importance of respecting mine. He sat back, satisfied. But there was still one more thing to do. Frank stood, stretched, and walked out onto the porch. He half expected Todd to jump out from behind a bush with a telephoto lens. But the street was quiet. Then he saw her, Linda, walking briskly toward his property, clipboard in hand, determination radiating from her like static. She stomped up his driveway. Frank, she barked. We need to talk. No, Frank said calmly. We really don't. She thrust the latest notice toward him. You are violating. Linda, Frank said, voice steady. I'm not in your HOA. She pointed at him accusingly. We've escalated this. Expect consequences. Frank smiled gently. Oh, I do. He walked past her and placed the freshly printed envelope into his mailbox. Good day, Linda, she sputtered, turning red, unsure how to respond because Frank wasn't arguing anymore. He wasn't fighting. He was finishing. As he walked back toward his house, he could feel the shift. Not just in him, but in the whole situation. A line had been drawn, finally and clearly. The HOA wanted escalation. They were about to get it. He looked at Hopper, who was waiting at the doorway. They have no idea what's coming next, Frank murmured. And he was right. They truly didn't. Frank always suspected the HOA board had a flair for drama. But even he wasn't prepared for what came next. It started on a Wednesday morning, the kind of morning that should have been uneventful, where the biggest decision was whether to have 1 cup of coffee or 2. But as he stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, he saw signs of something brewing. Literally. 3 neighbors were standing on the sidewalk muttering like they were discussing a weather alert. 2 others were filming something on their phones. And at the end of the cul-de-sac, a small crowd was gathering outside the community clubhouse. Hopper stood beside him, tail wagging. Frank squinted. What in the world? Then he saw Linda, clipboard clutched, chin elevated, marching toward the clubhouse with the brisk efficiency of a woman who believed she commanded the nation's nuclear codes. Behind her, Marla carried a stack of binders so large it looked like she was training for a strongman competition. Todd was there too, camera in hand. ready to document whatever historical event he thought was about to occur. Frank looked at Hopper. "Think they're having a high council meeting about my truck?" he joked. He wasn't far off. He wandered down toward the sidewalk, hands in pockets, casual as a man watching birds. Several neighbors saw him and whispered excitedly. One even said, "There he is," like Frank was some cryptid they'd finally spotted in the wild. Inside the clubhouse, through the window, he saw folding chairs filled with HOA board members and a large banner taped to the wall. "Emergency session, community standards crisis." Frank chuckled. Crisis? Over a truck parked in a driveway he legally owned? He couldn't decide whether to feel insulted or flattered. But the real chaos began when Linda stepped outside and called for the crowd's attention. "Everyone, please gather. The board has just been made aware of new complications regarding common area access." Frank crossed his arms. "Here we go," he thought. Linda cleared her throat dramatically. "We have been informed that a certain resident," she side-eyed Frank, "is challenging our authority regarding community property." Frank raised a hand. "I'm not in your—" She held up a finger. "You've had your time to speak." Frank blinked. "I actually haven't. Not once." Todd snapped photos of Frank like he was interrupting a presidential address. Linda continued, "The board believes this situation may require legal intervention." One neighbor whispered, "Legal? Over his truck." Another murmured, "This HOA has lost its mind." Frank tried to keep track of all the sideways glances and murmured gossip, but Linda's voice cut through again. "We'll be consulting with our attorney," she declared, "to discuss punitive actions." At that point, Frank stepped forward. "Linda, please tell me you're not wasting a lawyer's time over my driveway." Linda stiffened. "This is about community integrity." "Integrity," Frank repeated with a dry chuckle, "is a funny word for photographing my truck at sunrise." Todd snapped even more pictures. Frank added, "Do I get royalties for all these photos, or?" That earned a few laughs from the neighbors, much to Linda's irritation. She straightened her spine. "We can file for jurisdictional enforcement." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're going to enforce the HOA? Outside the HOA?" Marla whispered loudly, "We can try." Frank rubbed his forehead. "Folks, I've told you, I'm not part of Oak Ridge. The police already confirmed that." There was a collective gasp from the crowd. Linda's eyes widened. "Police?" Frank shrugged. "You called them, remember?" She sputtered. We called them to clarify property lines." "They clarified them," Frank said. Neighbors murmured. Someone said, "You called the cops on his truck?" Another said, "Over a vehicle? Come on." Linda's cheeks flushed. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped. She stormed back inside the clubhouse as if retreating from a battlefield. The crowd dispersed with excitement, people muttering about popcorn, drama, and whether they'd get to vote Linda out at the next election. Frank returned home with a quiet sigh. He hoped that would be the end of it. He truly did. But the next morning, a formal envelope was taped to his front door. Thick paper, embossed logo, smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. Inside lay a letter from the HOA's attorney. Or rather, the attorney they thought they had. The letter stated, "This office cannot support Oak Ridge HOA in this matter, as the individual in question is not under their authority. Any further action may expose the HOA to unnecessary liability." Frank laughed so hard Hopper barked at him. He folded the letter neatly, put it in an envelope, and walked it over to Linda's house. She answered, looking like someone who'd been awake since dawn preparing a rebuttal. He handed her the letter. "Thought you'd want this." She scanned it quickly, color draining from her face. No, this isn't correct." "Oh, it's correct," Frank said gently. "And I'm guessing the attorney didn't want to lose his license entertaining your crusade." Her hands trembled. "We're not done, Frank." He shrugged. "Didn't think you were." He walked away, letting her stew in the reality of the situation. That night, things escalated again. Not with notices, not with photos, but with a brand new group post in the HOA's Facebook page titled Urgent Community Update. Underneath was a paragraph written with the rage of 1,000 sunburned vacationers. A non-compliant individual is attempting to undermine the HOA by claiming ownership of community land. We will not tolerate attempts to destabilize our neighborhood. Frank smiled. Oh yes, this was the moment. The moment where everything was about to turn deliciously ironic. The moment when all the paperwork, all the stress, all the nonsense became worth it. And the moment the audience has been waiting for. He had to pause the story here, because this is where emotions peak, tension thickens, and the HOA's meltdown reaches its boiling point. And right here is where the perfect call to action belonged. So, with that same calm Frank used to disarm Linda's fury, the narrator would gently ask viewers, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. Then, without missing a beat, the story continues. The next day, Frank received a letter. Not a notice, not a warning, something worse. A letter titled, Notice of Common Area Access Termination. In other words, the HOA was threatening to revoke his right to step onto land he technically owned. Frank read it twice. Then he smiled. A deep, slow smile that meant the final phase was about to begin. He whispered to Hopper, they have no idea what's coming next. And oh, they really didn't. That letter changed everything again. Frank taped the HOA's dramatic notice of common area access termination to his fridge right next to a cartoon magnet shaped like a sleepy chicken. Hopper sat beside him, tail sweeping the floor, watching Frank with the solemn concern of a dog who sensed his human was about to do something important, possibly petty, and definitely funny. Frank tapped the paper with one finger. Buddy, he murmured, this is the moment we've been waiting for. Because unlike Linda and her clipboard militia, Frank understood something very simple. Paperwork cuts both ways. And while the HOA had been flinging notices at him like confetti at a parade, Frank had spent his nights researching. He'd gone down to the county records department again, spoken to the clerk, double-checked documents, and confirmed, without a shred of doubt, that the land the HOA used, their serene walking path, their ornamental retention pond, their precious community toolshed, sat squarely on the tax-delinquent parcel he purchased months earlier at a county auction for the price of a used lawnmower. The HOA didn't own those amenities. He did, and they didn't even know it until now. Frank sat down at his kitchen table, opened his laptop, and began composing a letter. Not snarky, not emotional, just firm, polite, and loaded with enough legal clarity to make any HOA board sweat through their matching polos. Dear Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, per your recent notice regarding my restricted access to common areas, I am writing to clarify the actual ownership of said areas. Please see attached documentation confirming that Parcel 18B, containing the walking path, retention pond, and maintenance shed, is owned solely by me following the county's tax auction. As such, the HOA currently occupies this property without a valid lease or easement. To rectify this oversight, I have included a proposed land use agreement. You may elect to enter into a lease at $85 per month to continue using the property, or cease all HOA use of the land within 30 days, remove structures, and terminate access. Kind regards, Frank Miller. Frank printed out the letter on crisp paper. He even replaced the ink cartridge to make it look extra professional, slid everything into a clean envelope, and walked it over to the HOA drop box with a spring in his step and Hopper trotting proudly beside him. He dropped it in. Thunk. And just like that, the fuse was lit. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up differently. No sprinklers, no calm, no coffee aroma floating lazily through the air. Instead, there was yelling, loud yelling. Todd was outside Linda's house waving a stack of papers. He owns the pond. Linda, the pond. We post pictures of the pond every fall for the newsletter. This is catastrophic. Marla was pacing on the sidewalk like a malfunctioning Roomba, muttering, he can't own it? He can't. He can't. But he does. Oh no. Frank sat on his porch with Hopper and sipped his coffee like it was a front row ticket to a live comedy show. By noon, An emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled. By 2, half the neighborhood knew about it. By 4, cars lined the street, people arriving with clipboards, lawn chairs, and even snacks like they were attending a tailgate party for suburban chaos. Frank didn't attend. He simply listened from his porch as voices drifted down the street. He sent us a lease. This is extortion. Actually, it's not, Linda, it's property law. Are we seriously paying rent to the truck guy? Oh hush, he has a name. He's our landlord now? My husband says we should have bought that parcel when we had the chance. Well, we didn't, Carol. Every few minutes, there were fresh outbursts. It says we have 30 days. What do we do with the garden shed? Do we have to give it back? Finally, the clubhouse door slammed open and the entire board stormed out as one miserable unit. Their coordinated march down the sidewalk looked like a row of talking bowling pins. Linda peeled off first, marching straight toward Frank's house like a general about to sue for peace. Frank stood as she approached, hands in pockets, expression mild. She stopped at the foot of his porch steps and stared at him with a mix of disbelief, fury, and something that might have been respect. Frank, she said, is this real? He nodded. As real as me not being in your HOA. Her face twitched. You can't do this. I can, he said calmly. And technically, I already have. She gripped her clipboard so tightly the metal clip rattled. Do you have any idea how this affects us? Frank tilted his head. Linda, you tried to find me for parking in my own driveway. You called the police on a truck. That was about community standards, she snapped. And this, Frank said with a small smile, is about property rights. She chewed her lip, visibly wrestling with the fact that he wasn't yelling, wasn't gloating, was just calmly being right. Finally, she exhaled. The board would like to negotiate. Frank nodded. Sure thing. My terms haven't changed. Her voice dropped. So we're really going to pay you rent? If you want access to your walking path and pond, yes, Frank said gently. And the shed? She muttered with defeat. And the shed? Frank confirmed. There was a long pause. Then Linda asked, quietly, You won't raise the rent, will you? Frank smiled warmly. Linda, I'm not trying to ruin anything. Just keep the peace. And keep your board from interfering with things that aren't theirs. Linda blinked. Once, twice, a soft reset. We'll sign. She turned and walked away slowly, shoulders dropping as though someone had deflated her sense of invincibility. That evening, when the sun dipped low and neighbors began walking their dogs, word spread quickly. The HOA had signed the lease. Some were shocked, others relieved. A few were delighted in a way that made them giggle behind their hands. At the next HOA meeting, Linda stood in front of the crowd, cleared her throat, and read the announcement. Effective immediately, Oak Ridge HOA will begin issuing monthly rent payments to Mr. Frank Miller for the continued use of common area land. A pause. Someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole room. Linda's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. Meanwhile, Frank sat at home with Hopper, munching on a slice of pie neighbor Jim had delivered earlier with a note that read, Long live the pond lord. Frank taped the first rent check to his fridge, right where that original violation notice once hung. Perfect symmetry. As he looked at it, he couldn't help but grin. Feels good, doesn't it, boy? Hopper wagged his tail in agreement. And for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Frank mowed his lawn while smiling. For the first time in weeks, Frank woke up to a morning that felt quiet again. Not the uneasy, loaded quiet of people plotting HOA vengeance behind closed blinds, but the peaceful kind, the kind he'd moved here for. The sprinklers were back to their regular chorus. Birds hopped across his lawn in their usual nosy way. Somewhere down the street, someone's coffee machine sputtered in familiar protest. And best of all, no envelopes taped to his mailbox. No photos being taken of his truck. No HOA patrol cars, also known as Linda's sedan, creeping by at 6:45 a.m. It felt like the universe had exhaled. Frank stepped out onto the porch, Hopper stretching beside him with the accuracy of an Olympic gymnast. Frank inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp morning air, then smiled at the sight taped to his refrigerator when he passed through the kitchen. Rent check number 1, perfectly centered, held by a magnet shaped like a sleepy chicken. He chuckled. "Never thought the day would come, huh boy?" he said to Hopper, who thumped his tail approvingly. The whole ordeal had been exhausting, irritating, and at times downright absurd, but now felt oddly worth it. There was a strange satisfaction in watching justice unfold at a pace only paperwork could provide. Slow, steady, precise, like a tortoise defeating a hare holding a clipboard. Later that morning, Frank grabbed a rake and headed out to tidy up some fallen branches from last night's wind. He didn't get far before he noticed something unusual. People, actual neighbors, walking up his driveway. Not with cameras, not with complaints, not with forms requiring signatures, but with smiles, baked goods, and the unmistakable body language of people who wanted to talk without the threat of a violation notice looming over them. The first was old Mr. Clements, carrying a plastic container of chocolate brownies. "Saw your, negotiations with the HOA, he said with a wink. "You handled it better than most diplomats I've seen." Frank laughed. "Appreciate it, sir." Next came the Forresters, a quiet couple who rarely left their house unless something dramatic happened. "We're just glad someone finally stood up to them," Mr. Forrester said, shifting a plate of cupcakes from one hand to the other. "Been years since anyone challenged Linda." His wife added, "She once fined us for having our porch light too bright at noon." "I believe it," Frank said, accepting the baked goods like trophies of suburban warfare. One by one, neighbors approached. Some offered thanks. Others offered stories, half comedic, half tragic, about their run-ins with the HOA. Frank lost count somewhere around the 8th casserole. It was like a parade of pent-up frustrations finally finding safe release. "You might have just saved us all," Diane joked as she handed him a pie. "You're the pond landlord, you know, the HOA whisperer, the truck guy warrior." Frank shook his head, amused. "Let's not start a fan club." "Oh, too late," she said with a grin. By mid-afternoon, Frank's kitchen counters were full. Hopper sniffed appreciatively at everything but behaved like a gentleman. Though Frank knew the dog was plotting which casserole would be easiest to accidentally bump off the table. As the day rolled on, the neighborhood seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Children rode their bikes again, families walked dogs, and the aura of vigilance that usually hovered over the cul-de-sac had lifted. There was laughter, chatter, the distant sound of someone fixing a squeaky fence. Normal life. Frank found himself sitting on his porch once more, watching all of it unfold. He felt lighter, not because he'd won some war, but because he'd restored balance. There was no gloating in him, no spite, just a quiet satisfaction that sanity had returned. And somewhere across the street, Linda stood at her mailbox, sorting through letters. When she noticed Frank watching, she hesitated. Her posture softened. She lifted one hand in a tentative, almost embarrassed wave. Frank returned the gesture. Not mockingly, not triumphantly, but politely, like a neighbor should. Despite everything, she was still part of the community. And Frank had never been one to hold grudges. A few hours later, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the cul-de-sac. Hopper nudged Frank's knee with his snout, signaling walk time. They strolled down the street, past the pond, past the tool shed, past everything that was now, by every legal definition, his. Frank chuckled to himself. "Guess we're landlords, buddy." Hopper wagged his tail with undeniable pride. As they walked, Frank reflected on the whole saga, the phone calls, the notices, the police visit, the dramatic HOA meetings. It all felt distant now. Almost funny in hindsight. He'd learned something important. Some people weren't addicted to control, they were addicted to feeling important. And an HOA for the wrong person was the perfect stage. He also learned something else. You can't stop petty people from being petty. But you sure can outsmart them. Especially with a little patience and a handful of well-organized paperwork. As he and Hopper reached the end of the street, Frank spotted a new yard sign in front of house number 19. It read, "Free the flamingo." He burst out laughing. Someone had placed a single pink flamingo on the lawn like a protest installation. Seconds later, Diane poked her head out the door and shouted, "The HOA already tried to find me. I told them to send the notice to their landlord." Frank nearly doubled over. The next morning, he overheard a couple complaining loudly in front of the clubhouse. "They fined our neighbor for leaving his trash bins out for 9 minutes. 9. But I heard they can't enforce half their rules anymore." Frank didn't involve himself. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't need to. The HOA had learned a lesson in boundaries. And the neighbors? They'd found their voice again. As the days passed, Frank returned to his quiet life. Fixing things, drinking coffee, waving at neighbors. Sometimes someone would bring up the whole ordeal, shaking their heads and calling it legendary. Frank always just smiled and said, "It was just paperwork." But each time he opened his fridge and saw that monthly rent check stuck beneath the sleepy chicken magnet, he remembered just how far things had gone, and how close he'd come to parking his truck somewhere else out of pure irritation. Good thing he hadn't. On a warm Sunday evening, as Frank and Hopper settled on the porch with a bowl of vanilla ice cream between them, Hopper got one spoonful, Frank the rest. He leaned back and watched the sun dip behind the houses. "You know, boy," he said softly, "I didn't plan on becoming the landlord of a pond, or a shed, or a walkway, but I'm starting to think everything happens for a reason." Hopper gave a satisfied grunt. "And who knows," Frank continued, "with this crowd, there might be another story brewing any minute." He took a slow breath, savoring the moment, the calm, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves. "Last week," he added with a chuckle, "they fined someone for having a pink flamingo. Maybe that'll be next week's story." He reached down, scratching Hopper's ears, and smiled into the quiet suburban evening. "So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine," he murmured, "just remember, you can't control the petty, but you sure can outsmart it."